Hey, traveler. Tonight I thought we'd talk about weird sleep habits of medieval people. Where are you in the world right now, and what time is it there? Let me know in the comments. It's wonderful to know where our fellow travelers are joining us from tonight. What would you do if your sleep schedule was dictated by the church bells? Long before the tyranny of the 9 to 5, medieval life was governed by the rhythmic tolling of bells, marking the canonical hours and, consequently, the rhythm of sleep. The medieval day was often divided into segments dictated by prayer times: prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, all segmented the waking hours. But here's the thing, these bells also implicitly structured their sleep. Imagine trying to get a solid 8 hours when a bell is ringing you out of bed every few hours. It's like trying to binge watch your favorite show with a toddler demanding snacks every 5 minutes. Now that's nightmare fuel. Key takeaway: church bells were not just for prayer. They were medieval sleep schedulers, whether you liked it or not. Now that we've covered the somewhat involuntary sleep-wake cycle dictated by the church, let's talk about a bizarre but common practice: segmented sleep. If you've ever woken up in the middle of the night and felt guilty for not immediately falling back asleep, medieval people would have considered you perfectly normal. But medieval people practiced what is now sometimes called first sleep and second sleep. The difference was the time gap. We feel guilty. They considered it a built-in meditation break. Sure, it wasn't always peaceful reflection. Sometimes it was just a chance to stoke the fire, or, if you were a medieval peasant, maybe contemplate the existential dread of another day of hard labor. It's like a built-in intermission for life. Imagine, between your first sleep and second sleep, a brief period dedicated to quiet contemplation, or perhaps you are having some late-night existential dread. Key takeaway: segmented sleep was not insomnia, it was a culturally accepted and even expected sleep pattern. Speaking of accepted practices, let's talk about bedrooms, or rather the lack thereof. What would you do if you had to share your sleeping space with your entire family, servants, and maybe even some livestock? If you've ever complained about your roommate snoring, medieval people might chuckle at your privileged predicament. But medieval people rarely enjoyed the luxury of private bedrooms, especially in the lower social strata.
The difference was that your roommate is probably just a snorer, whereas there might be farm animals living alongside your roommates. Sure, privacy was a luxury, but the communal sleeping arrangement offered warmth, security, and a constant source of body heat, which was vital in drafty medieval dwellings. Imagine the stories those walls could tell. Well, if there were walls. Key takeaway: medieval bedrooms were communal affairs, blurring the lines between family, servants, and sometimes even animals. But what good is a shared sleeping space without proper bedding? If you've ever splurged on a high thread count Egyptian cotton sheet, prepare to be humbled. If you've ever spent a small fortune on a memory foam mattress, medieval bedding practices might leave you feeling a little uncomfortable. But medieval people often slept on straw-filled mattresses, sometimes infested with bugs. The difference was hygiene. A modern mattress is a carefully sanitized piece of technology. Medieval bedding was, well, not. Sure, it wasn't exactly luxurious, but it was what was available. For royalty, of course, there were feather beds and finer linens. They probably weren't losing sleep due to bugs. One can only hope. Key takeaway: medieval bedding ranged from basic straw-filled sacks to luxurious feather beds, depending on social status. From bedding to darkness. Picture this: you live in a time before electricity, streetlights, and even reliable candles. The sun goes down and the world plunges into a deep, inky blackness. If you've ever struggled to fall asleep in a brightly lit room, medieval people would find your problem rather enviable. But medieval people dealt with extreme darkness. The difference was artificial light. Your room is brightly lit by the standards of the 21st century technology. Medieval darkness was dark. Sure, it was inconvenient, but it also likely contributed to deeper, more restful sleep cycles, at least when not interrupted by church bells or vermin. This is quite a contrast to our current era. Key takeaway: extreme darkness was a constant reality, influencing sleep patterns and daily routines. Now that we've talked about the darkness, let's talk about food. What would you do if you couldn't just grab a midnight snack from the fridge? If you've ever raided your refrigerator in the dead of night, medieval people might find your behavior rather odd. But medieval people generally ate their last meal relatively early in the evening, often before sunset. The difference was food preservation and availability. Your midnight snack is a testament to modern logistics. Their last meal was dictated by what wouldn't spoil overnight. Sure, they might have had some bread and cheese, but a full-blown midnight feast was rare. No midnight pizza. Key takeaway: meal times were dictated by the availability of light and the need to preserve food, leading to early dinners and potentially longer periods of fasting before sleep. Finally, speaking of weirdness, what would you do if your dreams were considered divine messages or demonic visitations? If you've ever dismissed a bizarre dream as just your brain being weird, medieval people might have interpreted it as a sign from God or the devil. But medieval people believed dreams were significant portents. The difference was their worldview. You see random neurological firings. They saw divine or demonic intervention. Sure, not every dream was considered prophetic, but the possibility loomed large. Imagine trying to fall asleep when any bizarre thought may actually be a genuine message that you need to heed. Key takeaway: dreams were considered potential windows into the divine or demonic realms, influencing interpretations of sleep and mental well-being.
Now that we've explored the odd world of medieval sleep, where bells dictated schedules and dreams held divine weight, let's delve deeper into how they actually prepared for sleep. What would you do if your bedtime routine involved checking for unwelcome guests in your bedding? If you've ever mindlessly scrolled through your phone before bed, medieval people had a slightly more hands-on approach to bedtime relaxation.
But medieval people often engaged in elaborate routines before even thinking about sleep. The difference was peace of mind. You're checking Instagram. They were checking for bedbugs. Sure, it wasn't exactly zen, but finding a scorpion in your straw mattress would definitely ruin your night. Imagine carefully patting down your sleeping surface, knowing that a single missed critter could mean a very unpleasant slumber. Key takeaway: pre-sleep rituals. Bedtime was not just about lying down. It was an active process of ensuring a safe and comfortable night. Speaking of comfort, this brings us to the topic of clothing, or rather, the lack thereof. What would you do if sleeping naked was the norm, regardless of the season or your social standing? If you've ever debated whether to wear socks to bed, medieval people likely had a much simpler solution: nothing at all. But medieval people often slept nude, year-round. The difference was practicality. You're weighing personal preference. They were grappling with limited resources and hygiene. Sure, it sounds cold, but clothing was expensive, laundering was a chore, and sleeping naked kept their garments cleaner for longer. And hey, body heat is body heat, right? Imagine the savings on pajamas. Key takeaway: bare necessities. Sleeping nude was a practical solution to clothing scarcity and hygiene concerns. But what good is a clean body if the air itself is filled with unsavory odors? If you've ever lit a scented candle to create a relaxing ambiance, prepare for a stark contrast. If you've ever spritzed lavender on your pillow, medieval people lived in a world of robust olfactory experiences. But medieval people lived with pervasive smells, both indoors and out. The difference was sanitation. Your lavender masks memories of the day. Their air was a constant reminder of it. Sure, it wasn't exactly aromatherapy, but they were probably too exhausted to notice after a day of hard labor. The aroma of the Middle Ages, let's just say it wouldn't be a best-selling candle scent. Key takeaway: sensory overload. The pervasive odors of medieval life were a constant backdrop to sleep and waking hours alike. From odors to remedies. Now that we understand the realities of medieval sleep, let's explore the solutions they came up with to deal with sleep deprivation. What would you do if your doctor prescribed a concoction of herbs and animal parts to cure your insomnia? If you've ever reached for melatonin, medieval people might have opted for something a little more adventurous. But medieval people relied on folk remedies, often involving unusual ingredients. The difference was medical knowledge. You have access to scientifically tested drugs. They had trial and error. Sure, some remedies might have worked, but others probably just tasted awful enough to distract you from your sleeplessness. Insomnia? Try powdered badger claws and see how sleepy that makes you. Key takeaway: medicinal mysteries. Medieval sleep remedies were a mix of herbal lore, superstition, and questionable ingredients. Speaking of remedies, Let's talk about the role of alcohol. What would you do if your sleep aid of choice was a generous serving of ale or wine? If you've ever had a nightcap to help you unwind, medieval people might have considered you a moderate. But medieval people frequently used alcohol to induce sleep. The difference was water quality. You're unwinding after a stressful day. They were avoiding dysentery. Sure, it wasn't always the healthiest option, but it was often the safest liquid available. Plus, a little buzz probably helped them forget about the bugs in their bedding. Key takeaway: liquid lullabies. Alcohol was a common sleep aid, driven by necessity and a lack of clean alternatives. If you've ever felt paranoid about leaving your windows open, medieval royalty had legitimate reasons to fear for their lives. But medieval rulers often employed elaborate security measures to protect themselves while they slept. The difference was the threat level. You worry about burglars, they worried about knives in the dark. Sure, it sounds stressful, but it was the price of power. Think hidden passages, loyal guards, and maybe even a food taster for your bedtime snack. Key takeaway: secure sleep. Royal sleep was often fraught with danger, requiring constant vigilance and elaborate security measures. From security to servants. It's time to explore the lives of servants who worked in the castles. What would you do if your job was to warm your master's bed with your own body? If you've ever used a hot water bottle on a cold night, medieval servants had a more organic solution. But medieval servants were sometimes tasked with physically warming their lord's or lady's bed before they retired for the night. The difference was labor expectations. You're seeking personal comfort. They were fulfilling a job requirement. Sure, it sounds awkward, but it was considered a normal part of their duties. Forget the electric blanket. Think human radiator. Key takeaway: human heaters. Servants sometimes served as literal bed warmers, highlighting the stark power dynamics of the era. Speaking of servants, this brings us to the topic of storytelling and the role that these stories played. What would you do if your only entertainment before bed was listening to folk tales, morality plays, and ghost stories? If you've ever put on a podcast or a TV show to lull you to sleep, medieval people relied on the power of storytelling. But medieval people often gathered to listen to stories before bedtime. The difference was the technology. You have streaming services. They had the oral tradition. Sure, it was less convenient, but it fostered a sense of community and provided a welcome escape from the hardships of daily life. Think of it as medieval Netflix, but with more dragons and fewer subscription fees. Key takeaway: narrative nights. Storytelling was a common form of pre-sleep entertainment, offering both amusement and moral instruction. But what good are stories if you're constantly worried about the supernatural? If you've ever had a nightmare that felt a little too real, imagine living in a world where the line between dreams and reality was blurred. If you've ever blamed a scary movie for your bad dreams, Medieval people might have attributed them to something far more sinister. But medieval people believed in a wide range of supernatural entities that could influence their sleep. The difference was their worldview. You dismiss it as your subconscious. They saw demons and spirits. Sure, it sounds frightening, but it also gave them a framework for understanding the unknown. Imagine constantly checking for demons under your bed instead of dust bunnies. Key takeaway: supernatural slumber. Belief in the supernatural permeated medieval sleep, influencing dream interpretations and bedtime rituals. And now that we have journeyed through the darkness of medieval nights, from the humblest peasant straw bed to the grandest royal chamber, it is time for us to say good night. May your dreams be free of bedbugs, demons, and the incessant ringing of church bells.
Now that we've said good night to the nobles and royalty of the medieval era and their luxurious yet precarious slumber, let's consider the unsung heroes of the era. What would you do if your day began before dawn and ended long after everyone else was asleep, and your resting place was no better than the animals in the barn? If you've ever groaned about your commute, imagine the plight of medieval peasants. But medieval peasants, the backbone of society, faced a sleep experience that was dictated by the seasons and the sun. The difference was their lack of options. You can choose blackout curtains. They were at the mercy of daylight. Sure, it wasn't exactly restful, but survival came first. Imagine trying to sleep soundly, knowing that tomorrow's harvest depended on your rest, or lack thereof. Key takeaway: peasant slumber. Sleep for the working class was a functional necessity, overshadowed by the demands of labor and daylight. Speaking of hard labor, this brings us to the topic of beds, or rather, the lack of them. What would you do if your bed was a pile of straw on the floor, shared with your family and perhaps a few friendly rodents? If you've ever splurged on a memory foam mattress, medieval peasants likely slept on something less luxurious. But medieval peasants often slept on simple straw pallets on the floor. The difference was affordability. You're debating thread count. They were finding whatever they could. Sure, it wasn't exactly ergonomic, but it was better than the bare ground. Imagine trying to find a comfortable position on a lumpy straw mattress. Chiropractors were definitely not a thing back then. Key takeaway: straw beds. Simplicity and practicality defined the sleeping arrangements of medieval peasants, dictated by economic constraints. But what good is a straw mattress if you're constantly being bitten by unwelcome guests? If you've ever dealt with a mosquito buzzing in your ear, prepare for a whole new level of nighttime annoyance. If you've ever used bug spray, medieval peasants faced a far more intimate relationship with insects. But medieval peasants cohabitated with fleas, lice, and other critters. The difference was pest control. You can call an exterminator. They were stuck with whatever nature threw at them. Sure, it wasn't exactly sanitary,
but they likely grew accustomed to the constant itching. Think of it as a medieval version of white noise, but bitier. Key takeaway: critter comforts. Sleep for peasants was often accompanied by a symphony of bites and itches, a constant reminder of their close proximity to the natural world. From pests to privacy, what if your entire family slept in the same room with little to no personal space? If you've ever wished for a moment alone, medieval peasant families had a much different concept of personal space. But medieval peasant families often slept together in a single room. The difference was domestic architecture. You have walls, they had, well, more people. Sure, it wasn't exactly conducive to romance, but it fostered a strong sense of community and shared experience. Think of it as a medieval family slumber party every single night. Key takeaway: shared sleep. Lack of privacy was a common feature of peasant sleep, reinforcing familial bonds and a shared experience of life. Speaking of families, this brings us to the topic of children.
What would you do if your children slept in the same bed as you until they were old enough to work? If you've ever debated the merits of co-sleeping, medieval peasants had a much less debated version. But medieval peasant families often shared their sleeping space with children of all ages. The difference was necessity. You're making a parenting choice. They were maximizing space and warmth. Sure, it wasn't always ideal, but it kept the little ones warm and safe. Imagine trying to get a good night's sleep with a toddler kicking you in the ribs. Sleep deprivation started early. Key takeaway: family bed. Co-sleeping was the norm, driven by practical needs and a lack of alternative sleeping arrangements. But what good is a family bed if you're constantly worried about the safety of your children? If you've ever checked on your sleeping child in the middle of the night, consider the dangers medieval parents faced. If you've ever worried about your child falling out of bed, medieval parents had far more pressing concerns. But medieval parents faced real threats to their children's safety during sleep. The difference was the environment. You worry about bumps and bruises. They worried about illness and accidents. Sure, it sounds stressful, but it was a constant reality of their lives. Think open fires, drafts, and a general lack of medical care. Maybe that badger claw remedy wasn't so bad after all. Key takeaway: parental vigilance. Medieval parents had to be constantly vigilant about the safety of their children, even during sleep. From children to chores, it's time to explore the impact of daily tasks on sleep. What would you do if your day involved back-breaking labor from sunrise to sunset, leaving you utterly exhausted but still struggling to sleep soundly? If you've ever collapsed on the couch after a long day, medieval peasants knew that feeling intimately. But medieval peasants engaged in physically demanding labor every day. The difference was the intensity. You might have a stressful office job. They were literally breaking their backs in the fields. Sure, it sounds exhausting, and it was. But that physical exhaustion often translated into a deep, albeit short, sleep. You can't argue with bone tiredness, even if the bed is lumpy. Key takeaway: exhaustion slumber. Physical labor dictated the length and quality of peasant sleep, creating a cycle of exhaustion and rest. Speaking of chores, this brings us to the topic of bedtime routines. What would you do if your bedtime routine involved securing the animals, checking the fire, and praying for a good harvest? If you've ever brushed your teeth and set your alarm, medieval peasants had a much more rustic routine. But medieval peasants engaged in practical tasks before bed. The difference was their priorities. You're preparing for the next day. They were ensuring their survival. Sure, it wasn't exactly relaxing, but it was essential. Think of it as a medieval to-do list, but with higher stakes. Imagine trying to relax knowing that your livestock could be stolen or your crops could fail. Good night and good luck. Key takeaway: practical bedtime. The peasant bedtime routine was focused on ensuring the safety and security of their home and livelihood. But what good is a secure home if you're constantly worried about the whims of fate? If you've ever felt anxious about the future, imagine living in a world where famine, disease, and war were constant threats. If you've ever lost sleep over financial worries, medieval peasants faced far more existential anxieties. But medieval peasants lived with a constant awareness of the fragility of life. The difference was their worldview. You worry about your retirement fund. They worried about simply surviving the winter. Sure, it sounds grim, but it also fostered a sense of resilience and a deep appreciation for the present moment. It's hard to sweat the small stuff when you know your harvest could fail or the plague could strike. Key takeaway: anxious slumber. Medieval peasants often went to sleep with anxieties about their future, their health, and their livelihood. From anxieties to acceptance. It is time for us to explore the spiritual lives of medieval people and how they influenced their sleep. What would you do if your dreams were interpreted as messages from God or the devil? If you've ever analyzed your dreams based on a Freudian theory, medieval people likely had a more divine interpretation. But medieval people believed dreams could have religious significance. The difference was their belief system. You might consult a dream dictionary. They consulted a priest. Sure, it sounds mystical, but it provided comfort and guidance. Imagine waking up from a nightmare and wondering if you'd just been visited by a demon. Sweet dreams. Key takeaway: divine dreams. Medieval people often interpreted their dreams as messages from a higher power, shaping their beliefs and actions. Speaking of religion, this brings us to the topic of prayer. What would you do if your nightly ritual involved reciting prayers for protection and guidance? If you've ever meditated before bed, medieval people often turned to prayer. But medieval people commonly prayed before sleep.
The difference was their approach to spirituality. You might seek inner peace. They sought divine intervention. Sure, it wasn't always a guarantee of a good night's sleep, but it provided solace and a sense of connection to something larger than themselves. Consider it medieval melatonin, but with more Latin. Key takeaway: prayerful nights. Prayer was a common part of the bedtime routine, offering comfort, seeking protection, and reaffirming faith. But what good are prayers if you're constantly disturbed by the sounds of the church bells? If you've ever been annoyed by the sound of a neighbor's dog barking, prepare for a more pervasive auditory experience. If you've ever complained about noise pollution, medieval people lived with the constant ringing of church bells. But medieval life was punctuated by the sounds of church bells marking the hours. The difference was the ubiquity of religion. You can wear earplugs. They were constantly reminded of God. Sure, it might have been disruptive, but it also provided a sense of structure and community. Think of it as a medieval alarm clock, but with more religious overtones. Hope you were up before they started ringing. Key takeaway: bell-rung sleep. The constant ringing of church bells served as a sonic reminder of time, religious observance, and community life. And now, as we leave the humble abodes of the medieval peasantry and the ringing of the church bells slowly fade in the distance, we must now venture into the more unorthodox corners of the medieval nights. What would you do if your very sanity was put into question? If you've ever felt a bit off after a sleepless night, imagine the plight of those labeled mad in medieval times. But medieval society had its own explanations for sleep disturbances and their link to mental instability. The difference was understanding. You might blame sleep apnea. They blamed demonic possession or an imbalance of humors. Sure, it wasn't always fair, but it was their understanding. Imagine trying to explain that you just needed a dark room and a white noise machine. Key takeaway: madness and sleep. Sleep disturbances were often linked to mental instability, leading to unfortunate consequences for those so afflicted. Speaking of oddities, this brings us to the topic of nightmares and their interpretations. What would you do if your nightmares were seen as a sign of impending doom or divine displeasure? If you've ever dismissed a nightmare as just a bad dream, medieval people may have taken it as a divine warning. But medieval people often interpreted nightmares as omens or messages from the supernatural. The difference was their weight they gave to dreams. You might journal about it, they might confess it to a priest. Sure, it sounds intense, but it was their way of understanding the world. Think of it as a medieval Rorschach test, but with higher stakes. So you dreamed you were naked in public? Maybe it meant the end of the world. Key takeaway: nightmare portents. Nightmares were taken very seriously, often interpreted as divine or demonic communications with weighty consequences. But what good is a dream interpretation if it's based on questionable science? If you've ever wondered about the validity of dream dictionaries, imagine trying to decipher dreams based on the four humors. If you've ever used a dream app, medieval dream interpretation was a far less precise art. but medieval interpretations often relied on the concept of the four humors. The difference was their understanding of the body. You might blame stress. They blamed an excess of black bile. Sure, it sounds archaic, but it was their medical model. So if you dreamed of flying, it probably meant you had too much blood. Best to go get bled by the barber. Key takeaway: humoral dreams. Medieval dream interpretations were often rooted in the theory of the four humors, an ancient and inaccurate understanding of the human body. From science to superstition, let's explore some of the more unusual beliefs about sleep and the supernatural. What would you do if you believed that evil spirits could steal your soul while you slept? If you've ever worried about sleep paralysis, medieval people may have thought you were being attacked by demons. But medieval people believed in supernatural threats that could affect them during sleep. The difference was their worldview. You might blame anxiety. They blamed incubi and succubi. Sure, it sounds terrifying, but it was part of their reality. Imagine trying to fall asleep knowing that a demon could be lurking in the shadows. Sweet dreams or not. Key takeaway: spiritual danger. Superstitions about evil spirits and their ability to influence sleep were prevalent, creating a climate of fear around bedtime. Speaking of spirits, this brings us to the topic of sleepwalking. What would you do if you woke up in the middle of the night, wandering around with no memory of how you got there? If you've ever sleepwalked, medieval people might have thought you were possessed. But medieval people attributed sleepwalking to supernatural forces. The difference was their understanding of the brain. You might see a neurologist. They might call an exorcist. Sure, it sounds extreme, but it was their explanation. Imagine sleepwalking into the town square and being accused of witchcraft. Oops. Key takeaway: sleepwalking spirits. Sleepwalking was often attributed to supernatural influences, leading to misunderstanding and sometimes dangerous consequences for the afflicted. But what good is faith if you're constantly worried about the dangers of the night? If you've ever felt uneasy walking alone at night, imagine living in a world without streetlights or law enforcement. If you've ever avoided walking alone at night, medieval people had very good reason to be cautious. But medieval nights were filled with real dangers, from thieves to wild animals. The difference was safety. You might call 911. They had only their wits and a weapon. Sure, it sounds scary, but it was part of life. Imagine trying to sleep soundly, knowing that danger lurked just outside your door. Sleep tight. Don't let the highwaymen bite. Key takeaway: nightly dangers. The dangers of the medieval night, from thieves to wild animals, made sleep a vulnerable time, requiring constant vigilance and faith. And now,
As we fade into the shadowy realms of medieval superstition and the unknown, it is time for us to explore the social and cultural factors that influenced sleep.
And now, as we delve into the final chapter of our medieval sojourn, it's time to turn our attention to the moment just before that nightly descent into slumber. What would you do if the time between sunset and sleep was filled with as much ritual and meaning as the hours of daylight? If you've ever mindlessly scrolled through your phone before bed, medieval people likely had a more structured and deliberate approach. But medieval evenings were often marked by specific rituals and practices. The difference was intention. You might be seeking distraction. They were seeking spiritual preparation, social connection, or simply a sense of closure to the day. Sure, it wasn't always exciting, but it was purposeful. Imagine putting down your phone and picking up a rosary instead, or perhaps a lute for a gentle tune. Key takeaway: ritual evening. Medieval evenings were often structured by rituals and practices that provided meaning and purpose before sleep. Speaking of rituals, this brings us to the topic of storytelling. What would you do if the only source of entertainment was a captivating tale told around the fire? If you've ever settled in for a movie night, medieval people gathered for evenings of storytelling. But medieval storytelling was a vital form of entertainment and cultural transmission. The difference was the medium. You have streaming services. They had a wandering minstrel or a family member with a good memory. Sure, the plot lines might be a bit repetitive, but it was a communal experience. Think of it as a medieval book club, but with more dramatic flair and fewer snacks. Key takeaway: storytelling rights. Storytelling served as a central form of entertainment and cultural transmission during medieval evenings, fostering a sense of community. But what good is a story if it doesn't impart a lesson? If you've ever watched a fable with a clear moral, consider the tales told in medieval times. If you've ever cringed at a heavy-handed moral in a kids' movie, medieval stories were often overtly didactic. But medieval tales frequently served as a vehicle for teaching moral lessons and reinforcing social values. The difference was the intent. You might be looking for escapism. They were looking for guidance. Sure, the message might be a bit blunt, but it was effective. Think of it as medieval parenting through parable. Didactic stories were used to help children understand the complex world around them. Key takeaway: moral tales. Medieval storytelling served as a powerful tool for teaching moral lessons and reinforcing social values within the community. From stories to songs, let's explore the role of music in medieval evenings. What would you do if the only soundtrack to your life was the sound of a lute or a simple folk tune? If you've ever listened to your favorite playlist before bed, medieval people often found solace in music. But medieval music played a significant role in setting the mood and fostering a sense of community. The difference was the technology. You have Spotify. They had a traveling musician or a talented neighbor. Sure, the selection might be limited, but it was personal and often participatory.
Imagine gathering around a fire, singing along to a familiar tune. Just try not to butcher the harmony. Key takeaway: musical nights. Music was an integral part of medieval evenings, providing entertainment, fostering community, and setting the mood for rest. Speaking of setting the mood, this brings us to the topic of light. What would you do if your evenings were shrouded in near darkness, illuminated only by the flickering light of a candle or a fire? If you've ever used a dim light setting on your phone to avoid disrupting your sleep, medieval people were masters of low-light living. But medieval evenings were largely defined by the absence of artificial light. The difference was the availability of light. You have light bulbs. They had candles made from animal fat or rushes dipped in grease. Sure, it wasn't ideal, but it created a cozy and intimate atmosphere. Just try not to set the house on fire. Key takeaway: dim nights. The limited availability of light in medieval evenings created a distinct atmosphere, shaping social activities and influencing sleep patterns. But what good is a cozy atmosphere if you're still hungry? If you've ever had a late-night snack, consider the evening meals of medieval people. If you've ever grabbed a quick bite before bed, medieval people had their own version of a late-night snack, often called a supper. But medieval suppers were typically simple and practical. The difference was the purpose. You might be satisfying a craving. They were often supplementing a meager daytime diet. Sure, it wasn't always gourmet, but it provided sustenance and a final moment of connection before sleep. Imagine sharing a piece of bread and some cheese with your family before settling down for the night. Simple, but satisfying. Key takeaway: evening sustenance. The evening meal served as a practical necessity and a moment of connection before the onset of sleep, often consisting of simple and readily available foods. From sustenance to spirituality, let's revisit the role of religion in medieval evenings. What would you do if your nightly routine included prayers, blessings, and reflections on your faith? If you've ever practiced mindfulness before bed, medieval people often turned to prayer. But medieval evenings were often infused with religious observance. The difference was the focus. You might be seeking inner peace. They were seeking divine favor. Sure, it wasn't always relaxing, but it provided comfort, guidance, and a sense of connection to something larger than themselves. Think of it as a medieval version of guided meditation, but with more incense and Latin. Key takeaway: spiritual evenings. Religion played a prominent role in medieval evenings, providing comfort, guidance, and a sense of connection to the divine through prayer and reflection. Speaking of faith, this brings us to the topic of superstitions. What would you do if you believed that certain rituals or objects could protect you from evil spirits during the night? If you've ever worn a lucky charm, medieval people had their own arsenal of protective measures. But medieval people often held strong beliefs in superstitions related to sleep and protection from evil spirits. The difference was the perceived threat. You might be warding off bad luck. They were warding off demons. Sure, it sounds irrational,
but it provided a sense of control in a world filled with uncertainty. Imagine hanging garlic over your door to keep vampires away. Better safe than sorry. Key takeaway: superstitious nights. Superstitions related to sleep and protection from evil spirits were common, reflecting a pervasive sense of vulnerability and the desire for control over the unknown. But what good are superstitions if you're still plagued by anxieties? If you've ever struggled to fall asleep due to worries about the day ahead, consider the anxieties of medieval people. If you've ever tossed and turned with worry, medieval people also faced their share of anxieties before sleep. But medieval anxieties were often rooted in more immediate and existential concerns.
The difference was the nature of the threat. You might be worried about your job. They were worried about famine, disease, or war. Sure, it sounds overwhelming, but it also fostered a sense of resilience and a deep appreciation for the present moment. It's hard to worry about the small stuff when you know the plague could strike at any time. Key takeaway: anxious nights. Medieval anxieties often stemmed from immediate and existential threats, shaping their approach to sleep and their appreciation for the present moment. And now, as our journey through the sleep habits of medieval people draws to a close, it's important to consider the overarching theme: the relationship between sleep and survival. What would you do if your very existence depended on getting enough rest, even under the most challenging circumstances? If you've ever prioritized sleep for the sake of your health and well-being, medieval people understood that connection at a fundamental level. But for medieval people, sleep wasn't just about feeling rested. It was often a matter of survival. The difference was the stakes. You might be aiming for peak performance. They were aiming to live another day. Sure, it sounds dramatic, but it was the reality of their lives. Imagine trying to function on minimal sleep when your next harvest could determine whether your family starves. No pressure. Key takeaway: survival slumber. Sleep was intrinsically linked to survival in the medieval world, highlighting the importance of rest even under the most challenging conditions. From survival to social connection. Let's think about how sleep, or the lack thereof, shaped social bonds. What would you do if your sleep patterns were dictated by the needs of your community? If you've ever adjusted your schedule to accommodate others, medieval people often had little choice in the matter. But medieval sleep was often intertwined with communal life. The difference was individual autonomy. You might choose to stay up late with friends. They might be required to participate in communal tasks that infringed on their sleep. Sure, it wasn't always convenient, but it fostered a sense of interdependence and shared responsibility. Imagine having to help guard the village at night, even though you're exhausted. Teamwork makes the dream work. Key takeaway: communal sleep. Sleep patterns were often shaped by communal needs and responsibilities, fostering interdependence and shared experiences. But what good is a strong community if you're constantly worried about outsiders? If you've ever felt a sense of unease in an unfamiliar place, consider the constant vigilance of medieval communities. If you've ever set up a home security system,
Medieval villages had their own forms of protection against external threats. But medieval communities often faced real dangers from invaders, raiders, and wandering criminals. The difference was the immediacy of the threat. You might be worried about burglars. They were worried about armies. Sure, it sounds terrifying, but it was the reality of their lives. Imagine trying to function on minimal sleep when your village could be attacked at any moment. Sweet dreams, and keep one eye open. Key takeaway: vigilant sleep. The constant threat of external dangers led to a heightened state of vigilance, impacting sleep patterns and creating a sense of collective responsibility for security. And now, as we reach the very end of our exploration into the weird and wonderful world of medieval sleep, let's reflect on what we've learned. From the grandest castles to the humblest peasant dwellings, sleep was a fundamental aspect of life, shaped by social class, religious beliefs, and the ever-present struggle for survival. If you've ever stayed up late contemplating the mysteries of the universe, medieval people also pondered the nature of sleep and its significance. But medieval understandings of sleep were often intertwined with superstition and folklore. The difference was their scientific knowledge. You might consult a sleep specialist. They might consult a wise woman or a priest. Sure, it wasn't always accurate, but it was their way of making sense of the world. Imagine trying to explain REM sleep to someone who believes in demonic possession. Good luck with that. Key takeaway: medieval mysteries. Sleep was a subject of fascination and speculation in the medieval world, often understood through the lens of superstition and folklore. As we gently close the door on this historical chapter, may your own sleep be a haven, a peaceful escape from the clamor of the world. Whether you find yourself drifting off in a luxurious modern bed or a simple, quiet space, remember the medieval peasants who sought rest on their straw pallets, the watchful parents guarding their children from the dangers of the night, and the weary travelers seeking shelter from the unknown. And now, dear insomniac friend, as the first hints of dawn begin to paint the sky, it is time to bid you farewell. Thank you for joining me on this nocturnal journey into the heart of the medieval night. May your slumber be restorative, your dreams be sweet, and may the echoes of history provide a sense of comfort and connection in the stillness of the night. Good night, and may you finally find the rest you seek.